Let's start with what you've been writing about, the debt issuance, the worries that we have about Oracle, and basically business is able to afford the AI infrastructure build-out.
That's right. One of the big drivers of U.S. GDP growth in the last year has really been the data center build-out, about 1%, 1.6% of U.S. GDP, probably 3% next year. It's funded a lot by debt, about 60 to 70% of it.
Okay. Funded by debt. How does you, as a VC backer, someone who's found unicorns out there who keeps striking gold, how does that matter to you if some of the biggest companies out there are financing the AI infrastructure with debt?
It matters a lot because the startups that we back rely on these data centers in order to run AI. And if those data centers are ultimately healthy or unhealthy, it dictates whether or not there are GPUs, the processors to execute the AI. For example, we've been watching Oracle credit default swaps. You can see the spread on the CDS is growing to about 150%, trading at or near junk levels. And that's because there's broader concerns about whether Oracle can repay that debt. If you look at the cash flow from operations is negative, and they have 8 years, about an 8-year time horizon to repay that debt before they went cash flow negative. And so as a result, they're trading at junk, and that can be a concern if the ultimate demand for their data centers doesn't exist.
Well, Tomasz, what about the ultimate demand? You're the person who's helping finance the companies that want to use the data centers, or at least build upon models that are using them.
Well, right now, you see the major hyperscalers, they're sold 2 years out on their GPUs. Neoclouds, which are the smaller GPU data center companies, are also growing incredibly quickly. The vast majority of AI today is text. As we heard just a little bit before, we will see significant use of AI in the use of video. And as we've seen with Netflix and others, video takes about 100 to 1,000x the overall consumption. So right now, as of this moment, there's no real concern around overall AI demand. We see plenty of it. But what we're watching is if there's any slip, if there's a change in the dynamic between NVIDIA and Google GPUs, if there's a change in the overall consumption, if open source models, because they're so much more efficient, ultimately take GPU cycles away from some of these data centers, the massive expectations placed on these companies could be crushing.
What about the regulatory landscape? We were just talking about that with Miles Miller and AI oversight in New York, SF, well, on the West Coast in California. Does it matter to your startups?
Absolutely, it matters. One of the dynamics around regulation is the idea of regulatory capture, where the largest companies actually benefit from regulation. They have bigger balance sheets. They can sustain the regulatory costs, the lobbying costs in order to advocate for their long-term goals, whereas a smaller company, say a business that we back to the tune of 25 to 50 million, may not have those resources. So we would like to see very simple regulations at an extremely high level with a single regulatory body. And that way, startups can continue to thrive just the way they did in the early days of the internet.
Do you think the federal government will help pass that? Congress?
I hope so. David Sachs, who's the AI czar, has indicated that that is the intent, that the federal government pass a overarching regulatory regime, and ideally that simplifies and eliminates all of the state regulation, because if there's this panoply of different state regulation, just as there is with money transmitter licenses or within banking, the cost of doing business in each of these states increases, and that reduces the pace of innovation and ultimately our competitiveness, U.S. competitiveness in the world.
How is AI innovation from your viewpoint right now, Tomasz? How are we seeing some of your companies perform?
So the companies are growing at rates that we've never seen, 0 to 100 million in run rate in a year. That is now still rare, but was unthinkable maybe 5 years ago in the previous generation of software. So these companies are growing unbelievably quickly. Another data point that I'll share is that the pace of the models themselves, their sophistication, is only accelerating. So Gemini, which is the Google model, released Gemini 3, was the single largest step function in performance ever, which is wild, right? Because we think about AI innovation as on a step function of S curves, and we think at some point it will plateau. But if the recent data is any indication, the pace of innovation is only steepening.